Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Guide, a podcast about the history and heritage of the towns and cities of England. In this episode, we're taking a trip to the seaside once again, but this time we're visiting the Regency city by the sea, once favoured by royalty, and now a modern cultural colossus. We're visiting Brighton, of course. It's a city that had something for everyone and loads of history, as we shall hear in this episode. My name is Lee McGrath, and I'm delighted to introduce Daniel Gooch. Welcome back. What do you think of my statement? Brighton's got something for everyone, right?
I think that's right, and that's definitely something that we're going to cover today. One of the key points that comes through is Brighton is not just another seaside town. There are so many more diverse aspects to its culture and its history. When was the last seaside town we did? Was it Great Yarmouth?
Great Yarmouth, yes. And I think comparison's really interesting. The modern environment of Great Yarmouth is probably more in a state of decline, whereas Brighton has really grown quite a lot, particularly the late 20th century. And I think we'll get to why that might be in this podcast, although both places have abundant history. So as well as lots of things you can see in Brighton, there's a lot of history that's actually hidden that I didn't know about until we researched this episode. We will be exploring Brighton in 5 sections, and because we've got so much to cover, I think we'll split this into 2 episodes. And the 5 categories are politics and war, science and industry, which we'll cover in the first episode, and then in the second episode we'll cover arts and culture, urban layout, and finally reality versus expectations, where we will reflect on how the city compares with what we expected. In each of those categories, we will give our highly subjective score for historical interest. If you have any thoughts on anything we discuss or we fail to discuss, then please do drop us a line via our website, yeoldeguide.com. But before we jump into our first category, politics and war, let's have a brief historical overview of Brighton. First of all, where is it?
Brighton is on the south coast of England. That's the easiest way to describe it. It's a seaside resort town about 50 miles from London and facing the English Channel. Its location is very interesting because it's on the east end of really a continuous coastal built-up area that runs about 20 miles from Littlehampton in the west up to Brighton. But it did historically grow in isolation as its own town. So despite its proximity and continuous development with these other settlements, most notably Hove, with which it forms the city of Brighton and Hove today, we are, for the most part, going to be focusing exclusively on Brighton today. So I suppose you want to go back to its earliest origins as a place of human habitation. And there is evidence of some prehistoric settlements on the outskirts of Brighton. There are Neolithic New Stone Age remains that have been found at Whitehawk Camp on Whitehawk Hill in the east of Brighton, near to the racecourse and the marina. A causewayed enclosure from about 5,000 years ago has been found on Whitehawk Hill. Hollingbury Castle is an Iron Age hill fort in the north of Brighton. And there were some later Roman settlements in the area, including a villa at Preston Park, though none was of any huge importance. In Saxon times, Brighton was part of the Kingdom of Sussex, still remains in the historic county of Sussex, and then Wessex, and used as really a location for fishing. And its name dates from this era. It stems from the Old English Beorhthelm's Tun, which means Beorhthelm's farmstead. And this eventually morphed into Brighthelmston, which remained the town's name for quite a long time. In fact, in some official usage, it actually remained the town's name right up to the 19th century. Following the Norman conquest, the Domesday Book, our old source of reference, records 3 manors under the name Brighthelmston. There was still fishing carried on then, but it must have been a pretty small place because Domesday assesses its taxable value as being quite low. The annual rent paid by the town was only 4,000 herrings, which, if you want some kind of frame of reference, this was much less than was paid at other nearby fishing villages.
I love that they pay in herrings. What a great currency.
Oh, they must have had a few of them. So Brighton became a very small town-like settlement in the next couple of 100 years, with its street pattern laid out as a planned town around 1300, although much of the coastal land under the shore cliffs was lost to the sea at that point and in the years subsequently. The town's lack of good arable land meant that fishing, rather than agriculture, remained its main commercial focus for the next few hundred years, but it did remain quite small until it started to grow, first as an 18th century health centre and then as a leisure resort. Brighton was subsequently transformed from a fishing village, at that point really in decline, to a thriving resort town under its three most important influences. First, Dr. Richard Russell may not be a name that's familiar to you if you're not from Brighton, but he was hugely important to the development of the town. He popularised drinking and bathing in Brighton's seawater as a form of medical therapy from about 1750. Second important influence, the Prince Regent, later King George IV, Hugh Laurie from Blackadder, who patronised and popularised the town for 4 decades from the 1780s. He visited the city regularly. He had the famous Brighton Royal Pavilion built. Third, the railways, which reached Brighton in 1841. They traversed the South Downs, which made the town much more accessible as a leisure resort, particularly for people coming from London. And this helped to double the town's population in just 30 years after the railway opened. In the first decade alone after 1841, 2,806 new houses were built, which is over 6 times as many as were built during the previous decade. So the empirical evidence is there of just how important the railways were to Brighton. And it continued to be a hugely popular leisure resort throughout the 20th and right up to the 21st century, hosting political conferences, international businesses, numerous cultural events, as well as being very well known as kind of the unofficial gay and lesbian capital of England today. It was made a city, along with, as we said, its neighbouring settlement of Hove in 2000. It still has a thriving tourist and cultural scene today, welcoming numerous domestic and international visitors, including, for these purposes, us.
Yes. And I suppose with Hove, it does join on to Hove. It's a continuous urban area, but we have to draw a line where. And who knows, we might go back to Hove if we ever get around to it.
Material there, definitely.
Who knows? But it's a continuous urban settlement right along there. Shoreham, Worthing, it's hard to know where to stop, really. So in summary, ancient small fishing village, really, but suffered decline in the early 18th century. And it was really those 3 big influences you mentioned, using seawater for medicinal purposes, King George IV and railways that made it into the big city by the sea that it is today. Look, I think it is probably the biggest seaside city in the country. Maybe Bournemouth is a similar size or slightly larger, but it does feel quite unique in that sense. It's a large place by the sea, and it's well connected as well. Let's go into our first category then, which is politics and war. Now, in the overview, you just described how in the mid-18th century, the fortunes of Brighton took a dramatic turn. And you mentioned Dr. Richard Russell from nearby Lewes. He prescribed drinking seawater and sea bathing for medical purposes. But it was one visitor in particular, a few years later, that really put Brighton on the map. And who was that, and why was it so important for Brighton?
That man was George IV, uncle of Queen Victoria, son of George III, famous for ruling as kind of proxy king, as Prince Regent when George III suffered one of his major bouts of madness before he became king. Yeah, we do like to cover royal connections in this category, in politics and war, and he's definitely the obvious one to start with, because it's hard to think of any towns or cities in England who've had a closer personal connection with a monarch than this. George was Brighton's most famous patron. He helped to raise its status to one of the top resorts in the country. A character in Thackeray's The Newcomes from the 1850s credits George for, to quote, inventing Brighton. And really, it's little exaggeration to say that Brighton wouldn't be the city it is today without his influence. None of this is to say that Brighton wasn't already a fairly popular resort before George. His uncle, the Duke of Cumberland, had been holidaying there for a while, and more of the King's brothers, the Dukes of York and Gloucester, had come there in the 1760s. The town had numerous facilities in the late 1700s. It had 2 assembly rooms and libraries, a racecourse in Whitehawk, plus blood sports held in the centre of the town for the benefit of aristocrats, including stag baiting and cockfighting. But all these things really created a location that made it favourable for a royal visit. George first came to Brighton in 1783 as the Prince of Wales when he just turned 21. This visit caused lots of excitement in the town. There was bell ringing, there was fireworks, there was a gun salute, which apparently killed one of the gunners, unfortunately. He started visiting regularly. He bought a house there, Grove House, which had belonged to the Duke of Cumberland and stands on the site of the Brighton Pavilion Music Room today. And he had the famous Royal Pavilion built from 1787, although it was extensively altered later. After George's death in 1820, his younger brother and successor, William IV, came to visit the pier and pavilion. He stayed in the pavilion a few times. But their niece, Queen Victoria, who succeeded William, she visited a few times, but she sold the pavilion to the town for about a seventh of the cost of its construction because she decided she didn't really like the lack of privacy there.
Bit miserable.
So it is a bit.
The key thing is George IV really liked it. What do you think attracted George IV to Brighton, if you had to speculate?
Possibly because it was just a place to have fun, to indulge in pleasures, which he was pretty famous for, rebelling against this straight-laced, serious nature of his father, George III, who he actually spoke about the town. George III described Brighton as treeless land, shadeless, short, and shipless sea. So he didn't like the place. And part of this indulgence, this rebellion, was the fact that George was able to see Maria Fitzherbert, his famously illegitimate first wife, who lived in Brighton at Steen House, now the YMCA, died there in 1837 and is buried in Brighton at St John's Church. Now, St John's Church is a Catholic church, and that is important to this story because famously George IV, by marrying a Catholic, would have become ineligible to inherit the throne. However, the marriage, although he went through it with ceremony, was actually illegal because by law, as Prince of Wales, he required the King's consent to marry, and this meant that Maria was never secure in her status as the Royal Marriages Act had already been used to annul one of George's brother's marriages, so it was never going to work legally. Nonetheless, George went through with the ceremony, married Maria because she was deeply religious and she wouldn't just be his mistress outside wedlock. And they did both spend time together in Brighton in 1786. They did the usual resort pastimes like watching races, going to the theatre, that kind of thing. George did eventually get married legitimately to Caroline of Brunswick. They famously didn't get on, to say the least, but he brought her to Brighton a couple of months after the marriage, though they didn't actually stay at the Royal Pavilion because it was being redecorated at the time. There were lots of grand events and celebrations when they were there, plus official duties like army inspections. After the couple separated, George continued to visit Brighton. He still went to the races, he still inspected the army regiment, he still entertained guests there. George was even in Brighton when the momentous news came of victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, and he attended victory balls at the Assembly Rooms. So definitely a place that was close to his heart and that he helped popularise as a centre of fashionable society.
So that's a major royal connection for Brighton through George IV, and William IV, you say, visited as well, but by Victoria, that connection's gone. And I think it's fair to say beyond that, not much of a centre of royalty at all, or political importance at all, I suppose, until the 20th century when it became one of the centres for mainstream political parties and trade unions to use as a conference venue.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't think we can say that Brighton has been a nationally important political centre, but it has certainly hosted, in the form of conferences, nationally important political events. These are generally held in the Brighton Centre, which is one of the largest conference centres in the south of England, and opened in 1977. It's an unmissable site. It sits right on the seafront in the middle of Brighton. As we said, it's important politically because it's been used for so many political party and trade union conferences. The context here is that party conferences in the UK have historically taken place in seaside towns because they have so much hotel accommodation that's available outside the main tourist seasons. In 2024, just gone, for instance, Brighton hosted the Liberal Democrat Conference and the Trades Union Congress Conference, and it's held Green and Labour Party conferences as well in recent years. Some of the most notable conferences that have been held there include the very first conference of the Liberal Democrat Party when it was newly formed by a merger in 1989, plus a couple of very important Conservative conferences in the 1980s. It was the location of the 1980 conference when Margaret Thatcher made her famous "The Ladies Not for Turning" speech, which was in reference to her reticence to change economic policy in the face of rising unemployment. And it hosted the 1984 conference when 5 people famously but tragically were murdered and 34 injured by an IRA bomb at the Grand Hotel, where many Conservative delegates, including the Cabinet and the Prime Minister, were staying. And neither the Prime Minister nor any of the Cabinet, who were all on the lower floors below the level of the explosion, died. And despite the attack, the conference still started on time, just 6.5 hours after the bomb exploded. However, there were deaths. The Deputy Chief Whip was killed. A regional chairman's wife was decapitated by tiles from her exploded bathroom. And the Minister Norman Tebbett's wife was left paralysed for life. So a famous event, but an indisputably brutal and tragic one.
Yeah, it's not a happy association with Brighton, but it's a historic one, which is why we note it on the oldie guide. And it's such recent history in Britain as well, that the suffering of terrorism from the IRA, relatively recent history and a very prominent example there. So it is still used for big conferences, not just political ones, because as you say, it's so big and there's accommodation. The two main parties seem to be going to Liverpool and Manchester at the moment, but historically it was the resort towns, Brighton, Blackpool, Harrogate, or seaside resort, a resort nevertheless. But let's move on from politics onto war. And when we covered a nearby south coast city, Southampton, there was a lot to say in terms of medieval fortifications and its major role in 20th century world wars. Brighton's nearby on the south coast. Has it had anything like that level of involvement in conflict over the centuries?
There's a few things to say. I'm going to start with something a little bit different. It's the Civil War. And you might be thinking, we talk about the Civil War all the time.
We
but actually
always talk about the Civil War.
We do, but it's a different angle today. It's not a battle, but the aftermath, because Brighton was the location from which Prince Charles, the future Charles II, escaped from England after losing the Battle of Worcester in 1651. The context here is very important. The Battle of Worcester was the last major battle of the Civil War. This was part of the so-called Third Civil War, which we spoke about quite a lot in our episode on Warrington, when the now executed King Charles I's son, this man, later Charles II, tried unsuccessfully to retake control of the country in alliance with his Scottish supporters, the Scottish Parliament having proclaimed him King of Britain, not just of Scotland, on the execution of Charles I. Now, Prince Charles had tried and failed to escape the country previously from other places. There's a story about one attempt at escape that the boatman who agreed to take him ended up being locked in his room by his wife because she was so afraid of the risks involved, so couldn't take him. But regarding Brighton specifically, the story recorded is that a friend of a friend of a friend of the prince was introduced to a boat owner in Brighton who agreed to sail 2 people to France for £60, which was probably a decent sum back then. And the cover story was that this man needed to flee the country because he'd been involved in a duel. Now, Charles had a dangerous journey just getting down to Brighton. He was nearly caught. He stayed in an inn in the town. And once there, it's recorded that the boatman did in fact recognise him, but still went through with it anyway. The boatman gathered a small crew for his boat, the Surprise, but seemed to be nervous. One story records him taking a bottle of spirits to calm his nerves and a clean shirt just to demonstrate some appropriate respect and decorum for the occasion. Now, the plan was for the boat first to head in the wrong direction, west, in the direction of its normal destination, which was Poole, to avoid arousing suspicion, with Charles on board disguised as a Puritan. And the plan was a success. Charles escaped to Fécamp in France. Later, after the restoration of the monarchy, when he was crowned Charles II, the boat was renamed, quite appropriately, the Royal Escape. It was moored as a kind of tourist attraction in London for years, but eventually broken up for firewood in 1791 in Deptford, so you can't see it anymore. But yeah, very important event in royal history there in Brighton.
I mean, it's a remarkable story that the future king literally fled the country, hidden away, stowed away in disguise on a boat, and he paid 60 quid, which is 14 grand in today's money, £14,000 in current prices. And I think there is a trail from the battle site Worcester all the way to Brighton via the various points at which he tried to escape. This was the journey where he famously hid in an oak tree, I think. Yeah, I only know that because I've spent a lot of time in pubs. Yeah. There are many pubs called the Royal Oak in Britain. So that's an incredible connection, really, between Brighton and a major event in English history. Was Brighton involved in any actual defensive conflict in the way that nearby cities were?
Yeah, I mean, its location on the coast meant it was always quite vulnerable to attack in a similar way to what we saw in the Southampton episode. In particular, it suffered from coastal raids by the French during the 100 Years' War and later during Henry VIII's French Wars. There was a great French raid of 1514, which, according to some, although I will say disputed, accounts burned down the entire town, which was mostly built of wood, except for one building, St Nicholas's Church. This church is, though, really the one physical remnant of medieval Brighton, one building that remains from that era. And it still stands today, although, as with many other medieval churches, it was extensively rebuilt in the mid-19th century. Now, that, of course, wasn't the end of these skirmishes. The English took direct revenge for the destruction of Brighton in an expedition to destroy numerous villages in Normandy, which was led by the splendidly named Sir John Wallop. In Brighton itself, gun defences were built on the coast, although the local historian Clifford Musgrave says that a lot of the early ones weren't actually of much use. So I don't know if they were there as kind of a visual deterrent or to help people out, or just a bit of incompetence, but there was some effort made. There was a further attack in this era on Brighton in 1545. This is part of the attacks during which the Mary Rose sank. So yeah, another fairly notable bit of a conflict there.
I think it's fair to say that there's less well-known or major connections with the world wars of the 20th century. There is a wonderful monument to the north of the city, the Indian soldiers who fought in the First World War, and that connection is there because of the Royal Pavilion, and you're going to talk about that in the urban landscape section. So there is a connection there with First World War Indian soldiers. But apart from that, I wouldn't say there's much of the First and Second World War celebrated so much in the city, probably because it didn't have that big industry that would have been a target, particularly in the Second World War. You know, we've talked about Southampton was heavily bombed, not so much Brighton, because it just didn't have that shipbuilding and major industry in quite the same way. I think we'll come to the conclusion on politics and war. What are your thoughts overall on the interest of the history and the contribution here?
Well, we found plenty of diverse topics to talk about here, and quite importantly, from different eras of British history. You've got Henry VIII's French wars via George IV, and one of the closest links any English town has had with a monarch, right up to what arguably the most notable government and one of the most domestic parts of military turmoil of the last 50 years in this country, with the Brighton bomb and domestic terrorism. And the events aren't just, interesting to a historian, but genuinely important, a lot of them. Charles II's successful escape, for instance, is a real turning point in British history. It's easy to gloss over just how difficult this was, and that there was really no guarantee of success here. Escaping hostile enemy from a country they now ruled in a small boat was a difficult and dangerous operation. You couldn't just jump on a private jet back then. You had to make your way by foot, by horse, however you would get there. And there was, as I said, no guarantee that would ever work.
Yeah, and think of the alternative histories if he'd been caught,
exactly,
or if he'd not managed to escape, or if he drowned in the English Channel. Yeah, it's a major turning point.
Definitely. Admittedly, Brighton has never been a major centre of political or military power on a national level, so it can't trouble the top scorers in this category. But for interest, uniqueness alone, I'm going to give it a positive score. As a reminder, on You Goldie Guide, we start at 5 and go up or down. So more than 5 is a good score. And I'm going to give Brighton a 6.
That is a good score for Brighton. I'm going to give it a 5, mostly driven by the role that George IV played. I thought that, it's such an integral part to the growth of the town, and also Charles II escape, both really important historical connections. So for me, it's a 5, which is not a bad score, considering Brighton's not known as a major centre of politics or the military.
No, that's definitely a good score.
That's a good score for Brighton. Tell us what you think of the scores. Do you agree with the scores, listeners? Our second category is science and industry. Like many coastal villages, the early industry of Brighton would have been fishing.
That's right. Fishing was historically Brighton's main industry. The reasons are very interesting, not just the obvious factor of the proximity of the sea, but the fact that there wasn't much farming of crops in Brighton, as the land just wasn't very good for it. There wasn't any natural harbour at Brighton, so the fishing boats used to be just launched from the beach, which gives you some idea that it wasn't huge scale. But it did peak by about 1580, when there were about 80 fishing boats and 400 fishermen in the town. However, it suffered due to disputes with fishermen in Great Yarmouth, who controlled the fishing industry back then, and the fleet dropped to about 50 boats by the end of the 17th century, a number which halved roughly in the next 30 years, and really only revived a little by the early 18th century. But by that point, it definitely was an industry that had started small and was in decline by then.
Yeah, so I think, as you discussed in the introduction, that meant early 18th century Brighton had declined. It was a bit of a ramshackle place. Some of it washed away by storms. But it was really the mid 18th century that the fortunes of the town changed considerably and permanently.
That's right, because after fishing, Brighton became a major health spa. Now, this was inspired by a Georgian craze for bathing in the sea, which became associated with numerous supposed health benefits. That idea has never really completely gone away. Plenty of people still believe that seawater is some kind of miraculous cure for all sorts of ailments. Now, a man we mentioned earlier called Richard Russell was by far the most important figure in Brighton's growth as a health spa. He encouraged people to bathe in and even drink seawater as a form of medical therapy. He prompted this particularly in Brighton, where he moved his medical surgery in the 1750s. This was Russell House, which is on the current location of the Royal Albion Hotel. Now, Russell's proposed cures didn't just stop at drinking or swimming in the seawater. As Clifford Musgrave has pointed out, where would the doctor fit in if that was all you needed to do? You could just do that yourself. As well as this, there are all sorts of parallel medicines that he would prescribe, like crab's eyes, snails, woodlice, loads of other nasties, along with, of course, the old standard bloodletting. A monument was placed to Richard Russell on the Royal Albion Hotel long after he died, which said simply, "If you seek his monument, look around, in testimony to his importance in the growth of Brighton." Now, there's a question here of why Brighton in particular? Why was Brighton the location where people went to take seawater cures? One proposed answer is the ground. There was lots of chalky ground. There still is lots of chalky ground in Brighton, plus the lack of a river. And people said, well, you don't have a river there. You've got lots of nice, pure, chalky ground. That must be good for the seawater over there. And people had been bathing in the sea at Brighton for medicinal purposes for at least a century before that. Clifford Musgrave, again, reports for death recorded in the parish register in 1641 as being of a woman who came for cure. So, yeah, it'd been going on for at least 100 years, and it had been recommended in other places like Scarborough since around 100 years earlier. It had become quite common by the turn of the century as a common form of pseudoscience, with published claims that it could cure everything from cancer and deafness to low libido and insanity. But bathing really picked up in the 1730s with the introduction of the bathing machine. You can see pictures of these quite easily on Google, but these were basically wooden carts that you would use to get changed in, and then you'd get rolled into the sea in them. Some resorts would use cables and steam engines or wooden rails for these. Some people would use horses to drag your bathing machine out to the sea. Oh. And all this gave employment opportunities to locals in Brighton. But this included many women who were attendants known as dippers, who helped the bathers in their machines to get in and out of the sea, sometimes by literally dipping them in. And there was later business in Brighton selling Brighton seawater to outsiders. So again, it was specifically and particularly Brighton seawater that was sought after. Some later doctors recommended mixing the seawater with milk when you drank it, which must have made it a tad more palatable, although it still didn't sound great to me.
No, it sounds disgusting to me.
Yeah.
Look, is there anything to this?
Does it work, do you mean?
Yes.
It's been kindly speculated that just making people relax on holiday, some kind of early form of holiday, have some fun in Brighton was the benefit. And maybe just stopping people from eating so much rubbish, given how much drinking a pint of seawater will put you off your food, might have been good for you as well. And it's also been suggested that maybe, and I do emphasise maybe here, seawater could have helped people with iodine deficiencies, which was a common problem in Britain back then, which Prince Regent himself might even have suffered. I think this theory has some modern correlation with the tested health benefits of seaweed. So to answer your question, maybe in some parallel ways, but don't let it put you off going to the doctor.
The dental ways, isn't it? I mean, I enjoy a bit of sea swimming. I think you feel better after a dip in the sea, but I think that's just the exercise of swimming and the coldness of the water. Cold water's supposed to be good for you.
Yeah, it won't cure a low libido. I think we can say that.
Yes, that's it. So you mentioned some gruesome spa treatments there, which are not unique to Brighton. I mean, I've heard about those at the spa in Buxton. It was clearly an era of daft spa treatments. But in Brighton, this industry of spa treatments, daft or not, gave rise to a lot of growth, a lot of development, a lot of employment, as you say. Really, the next wave of growth, though, came by allowing more people to indulge in the experience of Brighton, which came with the railways.
Yeah, that's right. And there's one railway in particular I want to talk about in Brighton. It's a bit different, a bit special. It's Volks Electric Railway. This is a small, narrow gauge tourist railway that runs along the seafront in the summer, still today. And it's important because it's the oldest electric railway in the world, still in use. The first electric railway in Britain and one of the first in the whole world. It's named after its builder, Magnus Volk, who was a German inventor and electrical engineer. And he also first installed electricity into the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. The railway was built in 1883, although about half was built as an extension in 1901 and some parts were closed permanently in the 1930s. Volk also built the Brighton and Rottingdean Seashore Electric Railway. Now, this was a railway that went through the water on a high single carriage on stilts. It was known as the Daddy Longlegs. This opened in 1896, but it was abandoned in 1901 because sea defences were built along the line of the track. But do have a look at it on Google. You can see it. It's fascinating seeing this huge platform going kind of standing above the sea, going along tracks that you can't even see under the water. It's a really unique thing. And I think the Toy Museum in Brighton has a model of it that you can see today.
Yeah, I know, it's remarkable. The Volks Electric Railway, one of the fun attractions of Brighton, well worth visiting. And I'll just clarify, that is a local tourist attraction, really, running along the seafront towards the east of the town, really, east of Palace Pier, towards the marina. But of course, the railways that brought all the people to Brighton were the mainline railways, of which it's still a major mainline railway from London to Brighton via Gatwick Airport. And we'll come back to that because I think it might be one of the reasons why Brighton is still such a successful seaside resort. It's very easy to get to.
Definitely.
Right, should we come to the conclusions on science and industry? Because look, that's really interesting history, and the spa resort is integral to the growth of Brighton. And the Volks Electric Railway is interesting, but there's not a huge amount of industry here. It's not known for its industry. It's not known really for scientific invention or discovery either. There's not much else there. The university is more of a modern university, so it's not been a centre where you're going to find lots of, internationally recognised innovation. So for me, in this category, Brighton's going to get a lower score. Still a good score. It's going to get a 4.
4. Okay, that's still not bad. Again, just to remind everyone, we start with 5, work up or down, so that really isn't bad. What do I like about Brighton? I think we like to look for uniqueness, something that makes a town or city stand out in the oldie guide. What we have with Brighton is a pretty interesting example of a very large town today, which grew rapidly in the 19th century, but not, as was much more common, due to pure industrialisation. George Bradshaw in 1863 described Brighton as simply the marine metropolis, and I think that's a pretty good description. Even then, he notes it was a commuter town with merchants buying mansions there, being able to travel into London quickly and cheaply by train via that famous Brighton line. And we haven't mentioned it yet, but Brighton does continue to have a strong economy today. It's been the European headquarters of American Express for many decades, so commercially it is doing well. I do agree. It's not going to come close to scoring the top marks because it never has been a major centre of scientific or industrial power. But what we found is pretty unique and apt to its coastal setting. So I'm going to give it a few marks for that. I think I'm going to give it a 4 as well.
Yeah, and I would just say on that point you've made about the economy today, it's for a seaside town, this is very diverse in terms of its economy, and it has far more highly skilled jobs. I think it has, I read a statistic, 33% of its jobs are in professional managerial roles, which compares with only 24% for most seaside towns. So it definitely has a more diverse economy than many other coastal resorts in Britain. So it is a bit different, and we'll come back to that theme in the following categories. Well, that's all for part 1 of Brighton. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back for part 2 in a fortnight. We'll be talking about Brighton's progressive culture and remarkable Regency architecture in the next episode. We might call it Pride and the Pavilion. Meanwhile,
You can find all our episodes at theoldieguide.com. Bye for now.